Welcome, everyone. My name is Yimei. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an organizer with the Trade Justice Education Fund. I'll be moderating today's teach-in on the End the Pandemic Now plan. Please note that we do have closed captioning for this event. You'll want to click live transcript kind of at the toolbar at the bottom and select show subtitle. Please also note you should be able to submit questions through Q&A. I am really excited about the speakers that we have lined up today for this event. We have Stephanie Gomez Fragoso, a health and wellness program manager at Latino Network in Oregon, JJ Klein-Wolf and Robin Sack, youth organizers with the Sunrise Movement in Portland, Dr. Gulrez Azar, a physician and public health researcher, and a member of the Coalition of Seattle Indian Americans. He is also a former senior fellow with the forecasting team at the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. We have Dr. James Pfeiffer, professor of global public health at the University of Washington and the executive director of the Health Alliance International. We have Dr. Rachel Madley, legislative assistant to Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. And we'll kind of close out the event with Julie Buana, director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, who will share how we all in this room can make a difference in this issue. Big thanks to our co-sponsors for this event, Portland Jobs with Justice, Healthcare for All, Oregon Action, and Washington Fair Trade Coalition. And thank you all for taking the time out of your day, your night to join us here. I think I speak for all of us when we say that we all want COVID to be over. You and I and everyone else here have been trying our best for 2 years to keep ourselves and our community safe, and we're tired. Meanwhile, all of our efforts to cope and survive are being undermined by a lack of action from our global leaders and by the greed of pharmaceutical monopolies, driving the artificial scarcity for life-saving medical technology. That's vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments. And I say artificial here not because there isn't a very real supply shortage, but because the supposed barriers to increasing that supply and increasing that access are fake. Researchers from Harvard and Columbia have identified more than 100 facilities around the world that could very quickly start producing mRNA vaccines if they had the permission to do so. And they could be up and running even more quickly if they were given some technical and financial support. The problem is pharmaceutical monopolies like Moderna and Pfizer refuse to let others make their vaccines which in Moderna's case particularly were developed with billions of taxpayer dollars. The sad truth is that selling boosters at marked up costs, currently 3 to 5 times the cost of production, to rich nations like the US and those in Europe appear to be a greater priority for these companies than ending the pandemic. Heading into our 3rd year of the crisis, billions of people around the world still don't have access to vaccines and treatments. If this does not change, we will continue to experience new COVID variants, and thousands of people will die needlessly every day. We cannot be lulled into a false sense of complacency because Omicron was quote unquote mild. Virologists will tell you that viruses are not predetermined to become milder, they only reproduce. Until everyone has access to medical technology they need, this cycle will continue with no promises of lessened severity. The good news here is that we can break the cycle of death and disease and all the accompanying economic and social hardships that go with it. The solution is actually very simple. We need to help the world make enough vaccines, test kits, and treatments so that everyone who needs them can get them. President Biden has the authority, the means, and the moral imperative to make this happen. Almost a year ago, he voiced support for the TRIPS waiver, the first piece in the puzzle in achieving vaccine equity. But the administration has not moved on it since then. It's been almost a year. It's been 2 years of the pandemic. We cannot continue to wait it out. We cannot continue to treat our aging and elderly neighbors as disposable, to discount the lives of our disabled and immunocompromised community members. We cannot pretend the pandemic away either. To do so would be to erase the lives of thousands of people who die every day, the lives of people suffering from long COVID, and the lives of their family members. Our speakers today will share stories of how this very real pandemic has impacted our communities here in the Pacific Northwest, and how we need very real global solutions to address this global crisis. Here to speak about how COVID has impacted community health workers, we have Stephanie Gomez-Fragoso. Stephanie oversees community health workers and community-based organizations in Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas counties.
Good evening, everyone. As it was mentioned, my name is Stephanie Gomez-Fragoso. I am Latinos Network's Health and Wellness Program Manager. And tonight I will be sharing the impact COVID has had not only on our community, but also the impact it has had on community health workers, who are certified individuals that have been on the front line of providing the community assistance during this time of crisis. It was during the pandemic that I was drawn into the field of community health work. The apparent disparities within my community were undeniable, and I wanted to provide services to help aid the disparities I saw. The ongoing pandemic has brought opportunities to grow with the challenges we are facing. It has been both isolating and empowering. I feel like a lot of the work we do has been behind the scenes of COVID response. Incredible essential services, but remote in nature, without the same level of social connection generated from in-person interactions. That is why I find the connections I make with the clients to be so important. And while it's difficult at times to foster those connections, they are what keep me motivated to continue the work. COVID continues to be the main subject of the services I assist with in my role, not to mention the subject of my day-to-day, which unfortunately means that there is a lot of mental, emotional exhaustion to cope with. Were it not for the support of my team, it would be difficult to continue the work. COVID has impacted the ability to connect with coworkers and clients. Meeting virtually has made it harder to gain the trust of our community. Also, focusing solely on COVID makes it hard to focus on other health issues that may be worsened as a result of COVID-19. Latino Network has served the community since the beginning of COVID, specifically the Latinx community. At first, it was hard to gain the trust of the community, especially because COVID was so new to everyone. Lots of false information, rumors were shared, and it was hard to explain to our clients that maybe what their relatives or friends were saying or what they were seeing on Facebook was inaccurate. The Latinx community continues to disproportionately be affected by the coronavirus. Data shows that about 22%, or 340 out of almost 16,000 Oregonians who tested positive with COVID-19 have been identified as Hispanic. But please do keep in mind that that number may be inaccurate due to those who do not report. When the vaccine first came out, my team had to do a lot of advocating. We opened up our hotline where the Latinx community could call to ask any vaccine-related questions. My team attended many county-led trainings and did lots of research on each vaccine to be prepared for any questions that may be presented. A common request by hotline callers was for the presence of CHWs during their vaccine appointments to help with translation and emotional support. Because of this request, we had Latino Network CHWs attend 2 to 3 vaccine events in the Tri-County every week to make sure a Spanish-speaking CHW was at an event. We also began hosting our own vaccine events where we partnered with different organizations to assure Latinx community had the opportunity to get vaccinated. Although these events were effective, we still had lots of advocating to do because the reason the Latinx community didn't want to get vaccinated changed from I don't believe in it or I'm scared to I can't miss work, which then led Latino Network to host our own vaccine event during days and times the Latinx community could attend. The biggest issue we are dealing with now is how can we help get the vaccine available everywhere and to everyone. It hurts to receive a call from a client who is in tears asking why their mom or dad, who is elderly and lives in Mexico or in a different country, isn't eligible to get a specific vaccine or a vaccine in general. But my team will continue to advocate for our community to assure everyone can receive a vaccine to be able to move on from this virus. But for this to happen, we need extra support from our leaders. So today, I want to ask everyone on this call to please share the importance of getting everyone vaccinated to your contacts. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please connect with Yimei, who then can connect you with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for all the work that you and your team are doing here in Oregon. And thank you so much for emphasizing that this is a global issue and we need a global response. Now we have JJ Klein-Wolf and Robin Sack two high school students and climate organizers with Sunrise PDX, who are here to talk about how the pandemic and corporate greed have been impacting our youth and our collective future. I'll pass it to JJ.
Good evening, everyone. My name is JJ Kleinwolf, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a youth organizer with Sunrise PDX, but most importantly, I am a student during the COVID pandemic. Before I speak, I would like to give a slight trigger warning for topics of mental health issues. When the COVID-19 pandemic started in 2020, I was starting my second semester of 8th grade. Now, I am almost done with my sophomore year of high school. The transition between middle school and high school for anyone in any normal year is awkward and difficult, and being forced to do that online is terrifying. As an extroverted individual, I thrive off of the energy of others. I enjoy being in communication with people, having classroom discussions, and being able to form those connections in person. But once the pandemic started, it made it so much harder to do those things. I've always been told about those life-changing friendships you make during freshman year of high school. And the fact that I was forced to make those through my 13-inch computer screen was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It will never, ever truly work. I struggled to make friends, to keep friends, and my relationships became strained. Those impromptu moments of conversation and connection I once loved became the most difficult and dreaded part of my life. I began to lose my sense of self, unsure of who I was or where I fit in. A number of my friends were staying safe because they or their family members were immunocompromised. They are forced to stay inside in an extra tight quarantine just to survive. A friend of mine wasn't able to leave her house and go even further than her backyard for almost 8 months because her mom had a terminal illness, and if anything happened, she would pass away. She couldn't imagine bringing back something from even a walk around her neighborhood that could contribute to worsening her mother's condition. And that is a stress that no teenager should ever have to feel. On the other side, I saw some of my friends so willing to put themselves and others at risk to be together, and I was jealous. I was jealous of their ability to disregard everything happening in the world and to go visit the Oregon coast, fly to their ranch houses in Montana, and travel to Hawaii at the peak of the pandemic. I was jealous none of them were dealing with the anxiety that I had around hearing Wolf Blitzer every day say, and today we hit our new daily high of COVID-19 deaths at over 5,000 people dying. All I wanted was for this to be over. The isolation affected everyone differently, and personally, I was hit very hard. I felt lost, like I was swimming along in a giant ocean of nothingness, trying to grasp on to anything that would pull me afloat. But it felt useless. Numbers of cases and deaths were not going down, and I needed to get out. After falling into a hole of depression that I could not see myself climbing out of, I did. It took time and love and support and space to grow, but I figured it out. And since then, I've talked with my peers about how the pandemic and isolation affected them. In short, they all had similar experiences. Being shut off from the world due to neglect of our elected officials and them not keeping our best interests at heart affects everyone. I can't vote for who represents me, but I still reap the consequences of their decisions, often more than my parents do. The effects of quarantine aren't short-lived either. I'm constantly dealing with the secondhand and indirect impacts of the last 2 years. I sit in my pre-calculus classroom and cry because I was taught virtually nothing while online. This isn't the fault of my teachers, because how do you expect a high school math teacher to explain the unit circle to a student through the computer? Adults want to set us up for success through funding our school's STEM programs and providing real-life experiences during high school. But where is this energy when bills and laws are trying to get passed? This is not only my education and my future, but that of 15 million other teenagers in this country. 15 million futures that are being put at the hands of adults who promise to have our best interests at heart, but only care about themselves in the end. 15 million kids who may never get to go to their homecoming football game or attend their senior prom or see their friends in a performance of Mamma Mia. It makes me angry that our futures aren't being prioritized because we can't do anything but hope that we are being listened to. Sitting dormant and waiting for wave after wave of COVID to hit is the new normal, but there is nothing normal about that. There is nothing normal about more Americans dying every day in the last month than at any other time in this pandemic. There is nothing normal about the way that we live, but how do the adults just sit here with their eyes and ears closed? How can we make you listen to us? I may be just one, but there are 15 million other futures, interests, and lives at stake waiting for you all to take notice and take care. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Robin Sack. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a sophomore in high school located in Portland, Oregon. Like JJ, I'm a youth organizer with Sunrise PDX. Thank you so much for having me here to speak tonight. I will be talking about two different crises, the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, and how those two crises are connected. And I will also be talking about how they impact those 15 million futures, interests, and lives that JJ just talked about. In Sunrise PDX, I have a role of organizing Youth versus ODOT strikes, which is a big part of our organization. And its main goal is to oppose the Rose Quarter Freeway expansion project. And that project is aiming to expand the I-5 freeway, an interstate route that traverses the West Coast, into the backyard of Harriet Tubman Middle School. This middle school is located in the Albina neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, and is a historically Black neighborhood. This project will add lanes to the freeway in a weak effort to combat vehicle congestion, in turn bringing it closer to the middle school. If expanded, the freeway will be just 30 feet away from the middle school. This project is funded and driven by ODOT, which is the Oregon Department of Transportation. There is blatant evidence of the harms that this freeway expansion will cause and/or further. Expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, the exact wrong move in the middle of a climate crisis, along with continuing air pollution into the lungs of kids in a historically Black neighborhood, and more. ODOT continues to lie to the public about this project. They are using their corporate greed and power and privilege to make people think that this is the perfect solution to a single problem, when in reality, it simply is not. It will only make that problem worse over time, increase carbon emissions and toxic fumes coming from single occupancy vehicles, along with continuing the historic environmental racism that the I-5 freeway has pushed forth since its creation in the 60s. ODOT is no different from the pharmaceutical monopolies that are keeping life-saving vaccine technology to themselves, just so they can continue to profit from it. As new, more contagious variants of COVID-19 surface, we see the gigantic consequences from that. Millions and millions of people from around the world still don't have access to adequate vaccinations against COVID-19, testing against COVID-19, or treatment for the disease. And the communities that are disproportionately harmed by this lack of access are low-income people of color. As we continue to see horrific numbers of COVID deaths globally, those pharmaceutical monopolies are to blame, because they are withholding the chance to end the pandemic now in turn for their own capitalistic greed. When will people in positions of power start putting people over profit? Both the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis affect everyone across the world and most severely affect marginalized communities. We cannot only protect our corners of the world. None of us are safe from the climate crisis until we all are, and none of us are safe from the COVID-19 pandemic until we all are. We cannot let wave after wave of COVID variants be our everyday lives. We cannot just sit by knowing that COVID-19 deaths in the US were higher last month than they've ever been, and people just seem to accept that now, which is just not right. That's putting my life in danger, that's putting my friends' lives in danger, and it's putting our futures in danger. And it's time for that to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ and Robin, for sharing your super powerful stories, speaking to our collective responsibility and calling out those really important connections. Next, we have Dr. Glores Azar, who is based in Seattle, but has witnessed firsthand the disparate impact of the pandemic on his loved ones in India. It's really, really fitting to have Glores here with our Sunrise folks in the same room tonight, as his research interests have included how heat and climate crisis have impacted health outcomes. He knows very well that there's no separation between over there and over here. We all share this planet. If the house is on fire, we cannot simply put out the fire in our one room and expect that to be enough. Dr. Glores Azar.
Hi, thank you so much. Gulrez, I use pronouns he and his. Hello, good evening, everyone. Uh, about me, I'm in a very unique position to speak about this. I'm a physician from a developing country. I'm also a public health researcher. And, I'm also someone who has a personal tragedy of losing dear family members to COVID. So I'm in a position, I come from a place of, from profound grief. The COVID pandemic has been particularly devastating for my country, for my state, Uttar Pradesh, and my family in India. India saw streets and sidewalks that were lined with dead bodies. There were rivers which were full of floating corpses. There were riverbanks which were lined with hastily buried dead bodies. There was drone footage all around of mass funerals. Despite people trying to arrange oxygen, they were desperate times and medicines. There were people who were trying to arrange them on social media. The entire healthcare system had kind of collapsed, crumbled. Well, the image conscious, the administrators, the government, they seem to be doing, what they do best, the image and narrative management. No photographs were allowed. They covered up the crematoriums. They undercounted the deaths. Clamping, was done with draconian measures against the people, own people who were desperately trying anything they could do to make sure their loved ones do not die. It was a period of absolute insanity. The government, with a straight face, declared that no one had died from the lack of oxygen. This, when the official number of COVID deaths was around 500,000, and unofficial estimates range from 10 to 30 times that. My entire family, immediate and extended, many of my friends, neighbors, and acquaintances were down with COVID symptoms. The health facilities there in my state of UP, the largest by population, approximately 200 million people, are so bad and overburdened that very few were able to get any formal help, testing, or treatment. I would stay up all night consoling my sick symptomatic parents, my in-laws, my brother, his family, and anyone who reached out for any medical advice. In a month, I had lost 2 uncles, my father's sister's husbands, leaving behind my orphaned cousins, 100 professors of my university, including 3 ex-deans of my medical school. They died. So many dead, and a face behind each number. One face was a medical school junior, a cardiologist, who had just a few months ago had placed stents in my father's heart, saving him from a heart attack. He died, leaving behind orphaned young daughters. Every phone call, every text message at that time will fill me up with absolute dread. That being said, among the foundational principles of public health, it's what they call the Alma Ata Declaration. It is considered the bedrock. It points out the existing gross inequalities in the health status of people, particularly between developed and developing countries. It is unacceptable and of concern to all, unquote. It also says that governments, quote, have a responsibility for the health of the people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate healthcare and social measures, end quote. While the COVID reality is that vast majority of the world's poor are still unvaccinated, even though we fully know that the best hope we have of truly putting an end to the COVID pandemic is making all vaccines free and available to every single person on this planet. Scientists around the world worked so hard to produce safe and effective vaccines that can protect us from infections. Taxpayers like you and I, through our governments, invested millions of dollars to make this happen. But as millions keep dying, life-saving vaccines, tests, and treatments, they're auctioned off to the highest bidder. Corporations, as usual, are putting people over profits. I, like many others, urge for a worldwide low-cost production to meet unprecedented demand by foregoing monopoly control over coronavirus vaccines and treatments that corporations are developing with our own taxpayer money. Dollars. I also call upon fair global distribution of the vaccines with those who are most at risk and in most need of receiving those vaccines first. It's just sad that India, which is known for generic pharmaceutical manufacturing, makes drugs and vaccines for the world, but doesn't have enough for its own people. My family's lives and the lives of billions of people around the world who still don't have access to COVID vaccines, they aren't disposable. But the pharmaceutical monopolies, they're treating them like they're disposable. And the US government is letting them do that. But their lives matter, right? My work for the past decade, that's on climate adaptation, how extreme heat impacts, health of people in poor countries. This, like a climate crisis, is a huge inequality issue. I keep wondering, what kind of future are we working for? As a medical doctor and a public health researcher, I'm concerned that this is not the last time that we'll see a global health crisis like this. So what were you doing about this? And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Yes, this is not the first, nor will it be the last global health crisis we face. As we talk about, ending the pandemic now, we are also talking about setting better conditions for the future. Here to talk about how we've dealt with previous crises and what we can learn from them is Dr. James Pfeiffer from the University of Washington. Dr. Pfeiffer has extensive research and implementation experience with the scale up of antiretroviral therapy in national health systems to treat HIV in Mozambique and Cote d'Ivoire with HAI and UW. He was involved in activism in the late 1990s and 2000s to reduce the cost of AIDS drugs through waiving IP rights through TRIPS. Dr. Pfeiffer.
Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Yimei, and thank you, Yimei and Julia, for organizing this really important event. I'm really honored to be here with such wonderful people. Thank you, Stephanie, JJ, and Robin for really powerful interventions and discussions. And Dr. Azar, wow, that is just so powerful. My condolences to you and your family for all that you've been through. And you've laid out some of the issues that I'm going to talk about really, really well. I'm going to try to use my 7 minutes wisely. I'm putting a timer on. My job is to remind everyone here, or tell everyone here, that we've been in a situation similar to this before. The reason why there isn't enough vaccine available, especially for the global south, is because pharmaceuticals that have produced, especially the mRNA vaccines, protect their intellectual property through World Trade Organization legislation called the Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, known as TRIPS. And knowing what the TRIPS is an important part of our struggle going forward. And it's through the WTO that countries such as India, South Africa, Brazil, others in Southeast Asia that have the full capacity and ability to produce mRNA vaccines are being blocked by WTO agreements that protect the patent rights of the big commercial pharmaceuticals. I would just, before I jump into this, tell everyone, you probably don't realize this, but the COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, are the single most profitable medical products in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, measured over a 1-year period. So they are making a phenomenal profit off of this crisis and off of these vaccines. And yet they are still clinging to their intellectual property and patent rights and saying other companies cannot produce these vaccines. If those companies were allowed to produce those vaccines, and if they had been allowed to a year ago or a year and a half ago, we would not be in the kind of predicament we're in. We would have been able to at least slow down what happened in India, as Dr. Azar pointed out. So it's absolutely outrageous that this has been happening, as has been pointed out. So I'm just going to quickly tell the story of a similar kind of situation a little bit over 20 years ago. Some of you may remember this, but I imagine many of you do not, that in the 1990s, as the world was confronting a really horrific pandemic of HIV around the world, tens of millions of people infected with HIV. And fortunately, in about 1995, antiretroviral drugs were tested and shown to be effective in knocking down the viral load, not a cure, but could save the lives of people. And they could, taking the drugs regularly, they would be able to live a virtually normal life and lifespan. And it was a wonderful breakthrough. But Big Pharma, that had the patent rights and the intellectual property protections for these drugs, were charging about $15,000 per person per year and would not give up those patent rights to generic producers. And as a result, many folks in the United States and in Europe started antiretroviral therapy, saved their lives. That was a wonderful breakthrough, an amazing thing. But it's only because those folks could afford it, or their insurance could afford it, or in some way they're able to pay that $15,000 per year. Now, there are many poor folks in this country who could not, so that was an outrageous injustice in itself. But what it meant was that most of the people with HIV were in the global south and still are, many in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Haiti and other parts of Asia, who were not able to access these drugs for many years in the 90s. So millions of people died of AIDS because they could not get access to antiretroviral therapy because pharmaceutical companies were protecting their intellectual property. And as I mentioned, in India, South Africa, Brazil, there were pharmaceutical companies fully capable of producing high quality antiretroviral drugs, but they were not allowed to by the WTO agreements. In the late 90s, long story short, it was because of massive global activism of a whole range of organizations, the South Africa Treatment Action Coalition, ACT UP in the United States, ACT UP Paris, Oxfam, Health Gap, many others, many folks in the public health world. Dr. Paul Farmer, who just tragically lost his life last week, was one of the leaders in the public health world, fighting for basically a waiver of the TRIPS rules that were preventing pharmaceuticals, especially in India, from producing antiretroviral drugs for a much lower cost, generic drugs. And so it was through the concerted activism all around the world that, again, it's a complicated story, but long story short, really shamed the pharmaceutical industry into backing down. There was a series of events between 1999 and about 2001 that led to WTO backing down a bit from its demands through something called the Doha Declaration, in which there was more leeway, what they call flexibilities in the TRIPS agreements that allowed generic producers around the world to begin to produce their own versions of antiretrovirals. And Indian pharmaceuticals like Rambaxi and Cipla were able to produce the drugs eventually for about $150 per person per year, in contrast to $15,000. Because of that, and because of new funding that came available through PEPFAR, the American AIDS Treatment Program, we were able to bring antiretroviral therapy to millions upon millions of people around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I felt very fortunate to be part of Health Alliance International, which worked with the Ministry of Health in Mozambique and Cote d'Ivoire to help scale up that treatment. And if for those who were involved in that world, that breakthrough felt like a miracle, because in the 90s, we didn't know how many more millions were going to die. And it was because of that activism that we were able to force the pharmaceutical industry to back down. And that is basically the message I want to give to you today here, is we are facing almost the same struggle right now, is that pharmaceuticals are saying these vaccines are patented. We own the patent. We have the right to be the only ones to produce these at whatever price we want to charge, which is outrageously high to begin with. And that is our right. And it's ensconced in these WTO agreements and trade agreements. That's why this is a trade issue, because it's the international trade agreements that enforce these things. And so it is only through activism and pressure from people like yourselves, all of us, demanding that the WTO embrace a waiver of the TRIPS intellectual property rights, that are going to allow us to win this battle. And I do think it is winnable. I would emphasize that President Biden has actually stated that he's in favor of this waiver. The problem now is we need to push as hard as possible for our own government to push the others, such as Germany and Switzerland, the other voting members in the WTO, to get them to relent and allow this waiver to happen that will unleash the many pharmaceutical firms around the global south that will then be able to produce the billions of vaccines at a reasonable price that can then vaccinate the global south. And as has been made clear here, if we can't vaccinate everyone or close to everyone around the globe, we are going to continue to have new variants. So this is not just about social justice and the morally right thing to do to get vaccines to everyone. It's also in our own self-interest here in the United States. We all need to do better. We all need to be vaccinated to prevent new variants from occurring. So, but it's activism, and I would say, and I tell students, I teach public health at University of Washington, that the biggest changes in public health actually don't come from epidemiologists and medical doctors. The biggest changes come from activism and average citizens mobilizing around key issues like antiretroviral therapy or around the COVID-19 vaccine. So I applaud all the people on this panel and the folks who are organizing this. It's your work, it's our work that's going to make a change here. And I think the next months are going to be very, very important. So we need to stay at it. I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering any questions when we get to the Q&A time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pfeiffer. It's really uncanny how history repeats itself. So the question for us all now, right, is where do we go from here? What are we going to do about it? So here to talk about the End the Pandemic Now plan, the 3-part plan for vaccine equity. We have Dr. Rachel Madley. Dr. Madley is a legislative assistant to U.S. Representative Pramila Jayapal and leads the Congresswoman's work on healthcare. Specifically, she is working to increase COVID-19 vaccinations around the world through additional action by Congress. Dr. Madley.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be talking about this because this topic is one of the Congresswoman's top priorities and has been for a while. So as others have really discussed, we have the technology to end the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of that technology was developed using taxpayer dollars. Now, what we need is the will to get that technology to everyone who needs it. That is a main reason why Congresswoman Jayapal co-founded and now co-chairs the COVID-19 Global Vaccination Caucus and has been pushing to increase global vaccinations since vaccines became available. Now, as many of you know, and as all of the speakers have so eloquently touched on, in order to stop the rise of COVID variants like Omicron and Delta, and finally end this pandemic, we have to increase global vaccinations. As of last month, only 5.5% of people in low-income countries were fully vaccinated. Now, when you compare that to the 72% of people fully vaccinated in high-income countries, the huge disparities in vaccination status are abundantly clear. And the magnitude of this global health crisis really requires us to use all strategies that we have at our disposal to increase vaccinations around the world. Now, that's where the End the Pandemic Now plan, also known as HCON Res 60 in the House, comes into play. Now, this lays out a clear roadmap for increasing global vaccination, as well as increasing production of test kits and medications. And again, as I said, this is a situation where we have to use all strategies and all tools at our disposal to fight this pandemic, because there is a vast need of those COVID vaccines, test kits, and medications. And so how do we meet that need? What does this roadmap look like? Well, the main point of the roadmap is that the US needs to stop pharmaceutical monopolies from withholding the vaccines and their intellectual property, and simply allow more facilities to make vaccine doses and other goods to fight the pandemic. The End the Pandemic Now plan lays out a 3-part program, all 3 parts of which Congresswoman Jayapal has been pushing for, not only as a co-sponsor of this resolution, but also in multiple letters and bills that she has been pushing on as well. The first part of this plan is to remove intellectual property barriers. Now, this can be done in 2 ways. The first way is a temporary waiver of the WTO rules standing in the way of production increases, or the TRIPS waiver, which is what Dr. Pfeiffer just spoke about. And this will allow countries to produce the vaccine without having the patents enforced. Now, the second way that we can remove obstacles to intellectual property use is in the case of the Moderna NIH vaccine, we can actually have the Biden administration exercise pre-existing Martian rights that will allow them to license any intellectual property developed with taxpayer dollars. Now, the Moderna NIH vaccine, it says it right in the name, it was developed with NIH funding, which comes from taxpayer dollars. So these are pre-existing authorities that the administration has to increase vaccine production and remove that intellectual property barrier. And so that is another thing that the Congresswoman has been pushing very hard for. Now, the second thing that the End the Pandemic Now plan calls for is sharing of the vaccine making formulas and other technical know-how with qualified producers around the world. As has been said, there are more than 100 facilities already in existence that are qualified to produce these vaccines. And so after we get the permission to make those vaccine doses in those facilities, we also need to make sure that the recipe and the composition and the technical data to make those vaccines is shared so that they can start producing them as quickly as possible. Now, the third part of the plan is to provide financial support for vaccine production hubs to get them up and running as quickly as possible. And what the COVID-19 pandemic has already done is just a huge disruption to the economy. And we really need to be putting in financial support to increase global vaccination so that we can end the pandemic and work on rebuilding not only our economy, but also our education system and our healthcare system. And so, as I mentioned before, Congresswoman Jayapal has led multiple requests to both congressional leadership and the Biden administration asking for additional funding dedicated to global vaccination. And most recently, she released a statement with the other co-chairs of the COVID-19 Global Vaccination Caucus in response to the White House request for $5 billion for COVID-19 response. And in that statement, we do express disappointment that there was not specific money in there for vaccine production. And we also express that while we're happy to see those funds being asked for, we do think we need much more money to increase global vaccinations to a percentage that will help end the pandemic. And so Congresswoman Jayapal is very proud to be representing some of you on this call, or to be your maybe district neighbor. And this is always top of mind for her and something that we are pushing on all fronts. So we are pushing on the TRIPS waiver, we are pushing on other intellectual property obstacles, and we're also pushing for more financial support to make sure that we can really increase global COVID vaccinations and end the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much for you and all of Congresswoman Jayapal's team for continuing to push on this issue. And what I want to make clear to everyone right now, we got a question in the chat and I'll kind of answer it now, even though it's not Q&A, is that, you know, what I really want to make clear is that this is not something that actually needs to pass Congress. As Rachel mentioned, you know, there are all these various means that the presidential administration can leverage to make these things happen, right? This means that we don't need to get Republicans to support it. We don't need anti-vax folks in government to support it. We don't need to overturn filibuster or any of this, right? The presidential administration has the authority and the means to deliver on this three-part plan. So our job, right, is doing everything possible we can to get President Biden to implement the content of the End the Pandemic Now plan immediately, right? There's no passing the buck to Congress. He needs to do this immediately. He can do this immediately. So what does he need to do? He needs to get on the phone with the governments of South Africa and India, who are the countries that first proposed the TRIPS waiver at the WTO, and agree with them on a waiver text, an actionable text, right? And call for the WTO to pass it at a general council meeting. He should have done this, almost a whole year ago now. There's no more waiting. He needs to do that now. He needs to, this week, really, 9 months ago, publicly share the vaccine making recipes that were created with US taxpayer support. The government possesses that info, you can put it online. And then beyond that, he needs to either incentivize or compel pharmaceutical companies and other intellectual property holders to license their technology to more producers around the world. You may remember he did this earlier in the pandemic when he convinced Johnson & Johnson to allow Merck to produce their vaccine. He still hasn't done that with Moderna or Pfizer, and their vaccines are much, much easier and less expensive for facilities to produce. So he can make this happen again. He can use the Defense Production Act or other laws to compel technology transfer during this national emergency. If the companies won't share their technology voluntarily, he needs to compel them to do so. And finally, with funding, he needs to make sure that the dollars allocated go out the door as quickly as possible, again, to help other nations produce their own vaccines. Long story short of all of this, we can end the ongoing health and economic and social suffering that the lingering pandemic is causing. But it's going to take decisive leadership on the part of the Biden administration, and we need to get them to implement the End the Pandemic Now plan ASAP. So before we get into how folks in this room can plug into the ongoing organizing around this issue, we were going to have Dr. Keshet Ronan from the University of Washington here to answer some questions. Dr. Ronan, unfortunately, ironically, has tested positive for COVID and is unable to be here today. I know that our Q&A is open, however, for folks to throw some questions in there. So why don't we give it a couple minutes? We are a few minutes ahead of schedule, a few minutes for folks to post some questions in the chat or in the Q&A rather. And we'll kind of go from there. So I see in the Q&A, we have a question that the question is, am I right then that we don't need to convince any country regarding the TRIPS waiver, given that the president can allow Moderna to be made elsewhere on his own? Do any of our panelists, I'm thinking either James or Rachel, want to take that question?
Sure, I can touch on it briefly. So yes, that's correct. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, since it was developed using taxpayer dollars through the NIH, under the Bayh-Dole Act, there are what are called Martian Rights that the government has, and essentially they can use those rights to license the invention, here it would be the vaccine, to any company because it was created using taxpayer dollars. Now, the other vaccines, they were not created as clearly with taxpayer dollars, although a lot of the basic research, again, was done with those dollars. So this mainly applies to the Moderna NIH vaccine.
I also want to say right now is that the situation we're in right now is that we don't have the capacity to produce enough vaccines for everyone to get what they need, right? So we need to rapidly and immediately ramp up production. And so that means opening up access to not just the Moderna vaccine, but also the Pfizer vaccine, and having as many options as possible and as many avenues as possible, right? Like Rachel said before, we need to pursue all strategies in increasing access to these essential medical technologies. And I see that James unmuted, and if James wants to step in here.
Yeah, I just, Rachel is deep in the weeds on the politics of this, but the waiver proposal was originally made by South Africa and India jointly because they have substantial pharmaceutical industries in their own countries. And it is likely that the WTO is going to be meeting sometime in spring. They were actually supposed to take this up in December of last year at what they call their ministerial meeting, which is their biggest meeting each year. And the president of the WTO has actually come out in favor of the waiver of the intellectual property rights. And they were supposed to make a decision in December, and then their meeting got canceled, ironically, by the Omicron surge. And so they postponed the meeting. And, tragically, in a way, that this decision is being put off. And it's really several European countries that have big pharma presence in their, strong lobbyists in their own countries that have been pushing back against the South Africa-India proposal. And again, US has come out in favor of it. So I think, there are global organizations, national organizations like the folks who organize this, who are going to be, paying attention to when this gets rescheduled, and lots of pressure will have to be put on. And I know Rachel will be working with Congressman Jayapal's office on how we really push the United States to use all of its leverage to convince the other European countries to, hopefully to come around, because once that if that waiver it's a temporary waiver, once that waiver gets approved, then we really can move quickly on producing literally billions of vaccines. It is both cost and just literally manufacturing capacity. There are dozens of firms in the global south that can ramp up their production very quickly. So that is going to be a really key moment, in addition to the executive action that Rachel alluded to that Biden can engage in. So kind of coming at it on all sides to undo these intellectual property protections. But stay tuned, because I don't know if anyone here, I was looking earlier, I don't believe the WTO has the meeting scheduled specifically yet, but it's hopefully going to be in the next couple of months. And that's going to be a real focal point for activism and pressure to try to get the waiver approved. Is that correct, Rachel, from your understanding?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. And I just cannot thank Congressman Jayapal enough, and of course her staff like Rachel, for really being on top of this. It's incredibly important, the work that you're doing.
Thank you both for that. I see more questions in the chat. We have, could it be explored again what countries are most equipped, pharmaceutically, technically speaking, to take advantage of a TRIPS waiver like this and hitting the ground running? I think, yes. So as alluded to before, researchers have identified 100 pharmaceutical companies around the world that would be able to rapidly adapt and produce the mRNA vaccine. And meet production standards. I think the best way to answer this question is maybe I'll put in the chat here the actual list of places that have been identified, as well as the criteria for identification. So as you'll see on many continents, Asia, Africa, Latin America, places that have experienced, disproportionate vaccine inequity, lack of access, do have the means to actually meet the technical requirements and quality standards to manufacture these mRNA vaccines. So the other questions I see here are about, how do we mobilize around this issue? We have a question about, do we have other means other than just petitioning? And so why don't we can move to, I'll pass the mic to Julie Buana from Washington Fair Trade Coalition to talk about action steps that we all can take here.
Yeah, thanks, Yimei. And so, yeah, I mean, here we are, right? We're 2 years into this pandemic, and half the world still does not have access to vaccines and treatments. And this is clearly unacceptable. But the question is, and this is the question that, you know, a few people put in the Q&A, is what can we as individuals do about it? And the reality is that we can end this pandemic. But it's going to take us pressuring our government to put global health ahead of the interests of big pharma monopolies. And so I'm going to go over 3 actions that I hope each of you will take, one of which that we'll all take together. So first things first, you know, kind of the simplest 101 level thing you can do is sign our petition to President Biden, urging him to implement the End the Pandemic Now plan that we just spent some time talking about. So I'm going to post the link to this petition in the chat now. And we're actually all going to take a second, because that's really all it takes to go in and sign this petition. So if you could go ahead and click that link, and just to show you how simple it is, I will do it too. Share my screen here. So when you click on the link, it pulls our petition up. You can read some more information. A lot of it we covered today. You can take a look at the text of the resolution, and just put your name.
And I just want to say that, you know, there are a lot of petitions floating around. What do? Just earlier last month, we released a similar petition that was signed by over 1,000 medical professionals around the country, calling for, you know, these 3 items in the End the Pandemic Now plan. And it actually forced the administration to give a response on the issue. And, you know, it was released and mentioned in the Washington Post, along with, you know, a response from the administration. Again, the administration that has not made good on its promises from months ago. And so, you know, right now, what's really, really important is making sure that folks understand that, you know, we still care about this issue and we're still here. There are folks that are still concerned about this, and we're not just going to pretend the pandemic is over, right? We're actually in this room right now because we want to take these steps, and that's super important. Back to you, Julie.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Yimei. But yeah, it's that easy. It just takes a couple seconds. I already signed it, so I don't need to add my name, but please do that right now. And it only takes a couple more seconds to send that petition out to your friends, your family, you know, anyone, you know, try to get as many eyes to it as possible and as many signers. And so again, that's kind of 101 level, the simplest thing that we can all do. But like someone brought up in the Q&A, there's a lot of petitions out there, and although they're really important, we need to up the pressure on the White House with a lot more than just petitions. So the next big step in this global campaign is coming up very quickly. It's March 11th, which is next Friday. March 11th is going to mark the formal 2-year anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring COVID a pandemic. And so on that date, there are going to be mass global die-ins in over 25 cities across the globe on almost every continent, including a couple local ones. So one at the Portland World Trade Center and one at the University of Washington here in Seattle. And so the purpose of this global day of action is for people around the world to voice our collective anger over how, heading into now our 3rd year of this pandemic, billions of people still don't have access to vaccines and treatments, and to call on our governments to prioritize the issue and do better. So we need your help getting involved and spreading the word. A poll should be popping up here on your screen with some ways that you can support the action. So why don't you go ahead and take a second to let us know by answering how you'll be supporting. You know, if you want to do all 3, then that's great. But, you know, the first thing is to RSVP at the links that will be posted in the chat if you're in the area and you can make the event. That's really the best way to support. So, if you're in the Portland area or in the Seattle area, go ahead and RSVP to those links and, show up and show out. Maybe if you can't make it, or if you can, spread the word on social media, right? Share the RSVP link with your networks, your friends, family, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, I don't know, anything. And then the last thing is, if you're a member of an organization, or you have like email lists or newsletters that you send out, we will be following up tomorrow with an email with all of this information. And in that email will be a template that we'll send about the day of action coming up. Taking that template and kind of plugging and play and forwarding that email out to any listservs or email lists in a newsletter, or really just emailing out to whoever is interested. This big collective action is, again, a way that we can put pressure on the Biden administration, and it's super important. And then the last thing, the last action I'll kind of go over now is, if you'd like to get involved in the planning for this specific, day of action or other tactics moving forward, I strongly encourage you to join our Pacific Northwest Organizing Hub. So, we're some folks that meet every Wednesday at 5 p.m. So if you're interested in getting involved in this work, please contact either myself or Yimei if you're interested in kind of getting plugged into this. I'll leave you with that and saying that we can end the COVID pandemic, but it's going to take collective action to pressure global leadership. So let's all get involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Yeah, I see a question in the chat. Can we put our email addresses somewhere? We can do that 100% right now. And while we do that, Noelle, could you do that? While we do that, I just want to emphasize, as we've been talking about this whole webinar, this is a global crisis, which means it needs a global response, right? And we are building that global coalition that is represented in the dozens of cities that are participating in this action, and the dozens of cities that will continue to put pressure on our elected leadership to put people before pharma profit, right? And so all of us here are doing our best in our localities and really demonstrating, right? Demonstrating global solidarity. And I think, that is going to really go a long way, like James said. I'm really encouraged. I feel so thankful for you all joining in on this tonight and sticking with us. As Noelle said, there will be a follow-up email with links in your inboxes tomorrow, so you can look forward to that. My email is there. Julie's email is there. I will also put in the chat. You can follow us on social media. All of it is under @TradeJusticeEd. If you want to tag this event, future events, and the pandemic now. And for more information about the things that were shared tonight, you can go to endthepandemicnow.org. Particularly if somehow you ended up here and you're not based in the Pacific Northwest, but you want to plug in somewhere, we have organizers around the country that you can link up with. And those are all listed at End the Pandemic. Oh, this is the wrong link. And thank you, Noelle. endthepandemicnow.org. Great. I think we can, I do want to address one last question that I see in the Q&A, which is there's a lot of talk about how we just need to learn to live with COVID instead of expecting it to end. What is your response to that? With enough vaccines available, can we expect to get COVID free in the near future? my response to that, and other panelists can feel free to jump in as well, is that we're not going to end this pandemic overnight. We need to, as Rachel and others have said, we need to do everything we can to end the cycle of variants. The way viruses work, right? The more opportunity they have to reproduce, the more opportunity they have to mutate. And the more opportunity they have to mutate means the greater chance of a variant, an unexpected variant that we won't know, what to deal with. In order to get a handle on this pandemic, we need everyone to be able to get access to vaccines, tests, and treatment, after folks get sick. Also shortening the time that people are sick reduces those risks as well. As for learning to live with COVID, I think that's why we're all here, right? We don't want to learn to live with COVID. And I see James has his hand up, so I'll pass it over to James.
Thanks, Yimei. You were answering that really well, actually. But I just wanted to emphasize that, as you were saying, that vaccine availability is really the key to learning to live with COVID. Right? It's we're hearing some voices on different sides of the political spectrum, like let's just move ahead. And the way to do that is to get vaccines as widely distributed as possible, and also have the systems to continue to vaccinate people with boosters. And from a public health point of view, what folks are thinking and saying and hoping for is that COVID becomes, or coronavirus becomes, more of an endemic kind of infection, similar to flu, in which there might be regular revaccinations every year in the way we get flu vaccinations. And we try to track as best we can new variants and have vaccines available, which means we need to get this vaccine technology out and producible in mass quantities in a way that we can keep the coverage going. And I would just add here, in terms of the global inequalities that Dr. Azar pointed out, not only do we have to get the vaccine technology widely distributed, we have to continue to push for stronger health systems all across the global South, so that those vaccines can be delivered effectively, hopefully in an integrated way with primary health care. So that's another part of the fight that the COVID pandemic has really revealed to us, is none of us are healthy until all of us are healthy around the globe, and how we need to really be pushing for stronger health systems, reduce the international debt so that countries can invest in good health systems so they can get vaccines out to their populations in a regular, routinized way. So a lot of work ahead, but right now the main focus is, being able to get these costs down and get the production out to everyone. And that's how we'll learn how to live with COVID.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you so much for that question. And I think, we can, if no one else has anything, any remaining questions, we can kind of close it out here. Please expect a follow-up email from us with all of the links that we mentioned, in case links weren't working in the chat, as well as for that template email that you can share out and spread the word. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to ask our panelists who are remaining to turn their cameras off so we can all say goodbye. Thank you so much for all of our panelists tonight, for sharing their time and their energy and their powerful stories, emotional stories, really real stories with us. And yeah, thank you all for attending. Hope you have a good night.